Okay, hi everyone. So thanks for joining us and welcome to the Open Web Foundry. We're going to be sharing a little bit about what Arweave is today and what profit sharing communities are, and then going through what the program is at hand. So let me just share my screen here and we'll go through a deck quickly. And then Seb will be taking us through some of the more details about the program. But first, we should just go through what exactly Arweave is for those of you that are new to the project. So Arweave is a permanent ledger of information at the basic level. That sounds essentially like a blockchain because it essentially is a blockchain, but the difference with Arweave is that it scales so that it fits very large amounts of data inside, and that there is sustainable incentives to store that data over very long periods of time built into the protocol itself. So how that works in practice is that instead of embedding data into the blockchain itself, we embed a Merkle root of the data into the blockchain, and then we generate a challenge to recall a certain byte from the network and the proof for that byte. So the proof of inclusion of that byte inside the network at a certain position as part of the mining mechanism. So this means that we're spending less of our hashing or less of our essentially power in the mining process on CPU and hashing, as well as pushing that to storage. So pushing it to making replicas of the information inside the data set that is Arweave. So that's how it works on a technical side. And this essentially scales to arbitrary sizes. So it's on-chain storage that scales is one way to think about it. And on the economic side, I hear an echo. Seb, is everything good there? Ops guys?
Yep.
I will assume that it is. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yes. So on the economic side of things, what we do is we create an endowment structure when we want to add data to the network. So you pay for 200 years worth of storage up front, which is sounds like a lot, but it's actually very cheap because the cost of storage is so low nowadays. It's approximately ½ cent per megabyte at the moment. And when you store the data in the network, instead of giving the transaction fee directly to the miner, what we do instead is we put the transaction fee, the vast majority of it, into an endowment. And over time, as the cost of storage declines, the endowment generates interest in the form of storage purchasing power, which is then used to pay for storage over time. And just like a normal university endowment and so on, it generates more interest than it uses. And as a consequence, it can essentially pay for storage indefinitely. This comes with a couple of base caveats, which is what is the expected interest rate or declining cost of storage? And in the real world, we've observed this to be approximately 30.5% over the last 50 years on average. And inside the network, we're expecting a rate of 0.5%. And for the real skeptics out there, where 61x margin is not enough, you can just think, okay, well, it's at least paid for storage for 200 years without any cost of storage decline. So it's very, very robust and very, very reliable and redundant at this point. Okay, so this is what Arweave does. But on top of this is the PermaWeb. PermaWeb is a set of protocols that expose a permanent decentralized web made of the information that's stored inside the Arweave. So that's not just static stuff like documents, web pages, media, images, all these types of things, but it's also dynamic things such as web applications. And that's what we're here today to look at. We're essentially here to decentralize web applications. And on top of the Arweave's PermaWeb, you can do this right across the stack. So you can host your UI on Arweave in a way that is replicated all around the world in a redundant fashion, such that it can't be censored, it can't be altered by anyone, including the person that uploaded it after the fact. It also covers database queries. You can put information into the network as a transaction, and then you can query that information back using GraphQL, just a normal, simple interface like you would in any JavaScript application, and it works in a decentralized way. And you can even build smart contract systems as well as back-end node software and run it in a decentralized way on top of this system. So you can cover the entire gambit of necessary components for a permanent decentralized web application. This is like a fundamentally different offering than what you would get in, I think I'm right in saying basically every other crypto-related project right now. We're focused on web apps, not so much, what do you say, decentralized finance systems and that type of thing. And the reason for that is that we believe that the fundamental problem with web services today is that users must trust companies. And the result of this is that what is in the shareholder of the company's best interest is what happens to the user. And that's a fundamental problem because the web makes up so much of our experience of life nowadays. We wake up, we check some kind of web service on our phone, like maybe 3 or 4 web services. We go about our day. Nowadays, given the pandemic, we spend basically all of our time in cyberspace using web services. And all of those places that we touch are run in the interest and the benefit of the shareholders of the company, or at least the power holders of the company. We can get to that in a second too. And so this leads to, we think, a lot of the really terrible things that happen on the web today. You could call it the lost promises of the Web 2 era. And this idea that we're going to have all of this new utility made available to us, when actually, really what we ended up getting was systems that kind of abuse our minds, for example, to keep us using the services for longer, regardless of whether that means they're serving us useful content or negative content that just gets people to interact out of rage, for example. I mean, that's just one area, but you can see in other areas, for example, just like GitHub would be a great example. Okay, you want to use private code repos on GitHub. GitHub is a good service. You have to start paying for that, and then once you're in the service, you're kind of locked in. You can't easily move out. You're using that infrastructure they've created, and you're paying for it every month. And if you try to stop paying for it, well, now the service is gone, and your private repositories are either made public or made inaccessible completely. And you're locked into that system. I mean, the essential process of Web 2 company design goes something like this. You have founders that have a great idea. They build it out into a small MVP. They launch it into the world, and people start to like it. Suddenly, they get a massive growth in demand. And then they have to either work out how to scale in a what's called bootstrapped way, which doesn't normally work because they have to pay for server costs and the rest while they're growing. And they have to compete with the people that take the alternate way, which is to take VC capital and to essentially give away large portions of control of the company that they're building, and subsequently the web service that they've built, to people that will bankroll it. And that there's nothing wrong with this, to be clear. Like this is not an unreasonable way to act. It's just everyone acting in the the incentives of the system that they find themselves in. But what happens eventually is once the bankrolling of the adoption phase of the product has happened, there's necessarily a lock-in that must happen, and then there's an extraction phase whereby the capital that was put in must be extracted, plus many, many more fold from the users that have become the client base of it. And part of that is to stop the users being able to leave. And this, so we want to incentivize people to keep using the products forever, regardless of whether it's good for them or not, and then make it hard for them to leave to use other products, because that loses the monopoly status of the project or company, and that fundamentally loses the shareholders' value. So we think there's fundamental problems at the core of society created by the incentives involved in the web application and Web 2 service ecosystem and essentially economy. So we're proposing a new paradigm. The new paradigm is that web applications and web services should be replaced with protocols, and that companies should be replaced with what we're calling communities. And you might know them as DAOs if you're from the Ethereum world, but we'll get into both sides. So web services built as protocols have many significant advantages. And you could even argue that actually when the web was first designed, it was designed as protocols by default. Every application you wanted to build, first you defined what the protocol of that application was going to be, and then you define clients to it. You can see examples of this in email, for example. Open standards like PostScript, when you want to format text documents, for example, you made that open so that people could plug into it. And it was only over time when people realized that the value accrual of these systems wasn't happening at the protocol level that we then moved to building companies that had this focus on locking users into using their products long term. But in crypto, of course, now we can build value back into the protocols themselves and allow people to capture the upside by supporting the protocol, not necessarily by supporting the company. So some of the advantages are that when you build an application like this on the PermaWeb, it enforces what we call consumer integrity. This is a bit of a weird concept to begin with. Once you grok it, it's pretty powerful. So on the PermaWeb, when you launch an application, once it's launched, it's out of your hands. The UI is there forever. No one can touch it, even the person that put it up there. And that sounds like it might be actually a bit annoying to start with, but then you realize, oh wait, so from the user's point of view, now the power relationship between the developer and the user is completely different. Now, the user can be confident that they're going to be able to use the service, this protocol, essentially, protocolized web app, forever in its current state or better. The developer can issue new versions of the application, but when they do so, they must be strictly better than the previous versions. And this means that the consumer is now able to trust that application at a much greater level than they could have done previously. This just changes the game. So one way you can look at it is to think about Weave Mail, for example, weve.email. It's an amazing service, runs a profit-sharing community. Very simple way of sending mail around the PermaWeb. You get someone's address, and you see them mining a block, something like this. You can send them a message, and you can also send them some tokens and all the rest of it that you'd expect. But you've got to compare this to Gmail, right? So when I signed up for my Gmail account, I don't know, 2008 or something like this, I had no idea what the privacy policy and what the terms of use of Gmail in 2021 were going to be. But I signed up anyway, and I got locked in because of that address. Because if I wanted people to know to email me, they needed to use that address, and that address was essentially owned by Google. And so now I'm stuck. And the quality of Google's services arguably not really improved that much over that period of time. And certainly they now use the data that I've given them for much more nefarious purposes. There was no way that I would know that. But if this was a PermaWeb protocolized web application, then I could see the UI one day, right at the beginning, and I would know the deal that I was signing up for straight away. I could say, okay, weave.email, as it exists now, it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good. I can be confident that I'm going to get this level of service or better at any point in the future if I use this, this protocol. It's very, very powerful, particularly for the applications in our lives where these things are particularly sensitive, where it's important that we know the deal before we walk into it. So they also enable permissionless innovation. This means that essentially, because it's a protocol, anyone can write into the database, if you will. So you define, hey, a tweet or a post in my system should look like this. It should have these and these and these attributes. And you can normally lay this out and just like, I did this with a decentralized Twitter replacement in 2 tweets, I think. They're normally very, very simple. But then, as soon as it's created, anyone can plug into this. And this means that you get a sort of combinatorial effect happening. So people realize, well, actually, there's already a protocol for this small thing I want to do in my application. What if I just piggyback on top of that? And now I've got all of the content that's available in that web application available in my web application. So suddenly the process of bootstrapping the content for your app is just is no longer a problem at all. You've completely solved it. And then on top of that, you're contributing back to the prior application. So it's a positive sum interaction. And then on top of that, you find that, oh, wait, if I just use the base, if I just use the basic, what would you say, representations of these, I don't know, common themes, if you want. So like voting in a DAO would be one of them. If I use the common version of this, then I find that all of the information from my system shows up in all these other UIs. So now it's helping you with distribution. This happened recently with a project called Koi, who built a new kind of, kind of off-chain compute system governed by a DAO. So the DAO is voting on the state of the off-chain compute over time. And what they found was that completely by accident, just because they used a normal format for voting on top of the PermaWeb, they actually had all these UIs that showed the state of their application inside ViewBlock, for example, or inside Community XYZ, and they got all these beautiful dashboards for their application for free. just because they were using the same protocols. It's very, very powerful. It's the same core concept of composability that you see in Ethereum, which led to the DeFi explosion, but essentially applied to web services. Okay, next up, they are ownerless. And so this is a pretty big deal, because it means that after the launch, no one can change it. And your access to it is not, would you say, mediated by any particular party. So if we think about cyberspace as it currently exists on the centralized web, basically everywhere we go, we are accessing someone else's property. Google can stop me accessing Gmail. I was going to say, YouTube can stop me accessing YouTube, but that's not true. It's actually Google, and so on. All of the places in cyberspace are gated by private companies, private organizations. And this means that your access to them is completely at their whim, which comes back to this, well, what are their incentives? Their incentives are just to do the best by their shareholders, which may not be the best by their users. And this means that on the PermaWeb, by contrast, we have a real area of cyberspace that is not owned or controlled by anyone. It's actually governed by code by default. Anyone can access this information from any gateway inside the network and essentially see the content. No one gates access to it. And that means that your applications can define how they are, for example, moderated. So there's new projects on top of Arweave, like Decentralised, for example, which are using DAOs to moderate channels that are sort of akin to, I guess you would say, Twitter timeline, shared Twitter timeline, something like this. Yeah, and the DAO moderates what content is seen there. And the DAO is the highest authority within this system. It's the only person that is able to decide what should or should not, or the only organization which is able to decide what should or should not be shown. And any community member that's able to write into that Twitter-like feed is a member of this DAO, and so has voting rights on that. And so we can essentially make it so that the users are the most powerful people in the applications with this system. Devs don't have to pay for compute. This is really important, because if we go back to our initial example of how Web 2 companies generally start, one of the fundamental reasons that Web 2 companies go to venture capital firms which want to buy into the equity to then eventually turn the company into a monopoly from which they can extract value, which again, it's no moral failing. It's just the way the system works. It's just what everyone is incentivized to do in the process that we've created. Part of the reason that devs have to do this is because every new user that they gain is more expenditure on compute. So if we look back to the beginning of Tumblr, for example, Tumblr raised money, not because they wanted to raise money or they needed to for growth, but they needed to pay $600,000 a month, I guess it wasn't AWS at the time, but server bills. And that led to the process that eventually actually led to Tumblr kind of, what would you say, self-destructing because of its new shareholders' desires about the content moderation on the policy, on the platform. Like long way down the line, that started the process that ended in the destruction of the platform itself. Whereas on the PermaWeb, the cost of compute is not on the developer. It's actually on the relationship between the gateway and the user. So as much of the compute is pushed to the user's client itself, so it's running on their machine, and then database queries are done on the gateway. And then there's some kind of economic relationship between the gateway and the user. And Amplify Network is making this part of their mining algorithm, essentially, that you should answer these gateway requests correctly for your users in an incentivized way, while also not charging the user. But that's another conversation. But this is a pretty key principle. The user no longer, or rather the developer no longer has to pay for compute, so the business model that they employ can be different. Finally, once deployed, the applications have zero maintenance. You just deploy it and it just runs. Everything is a protocol on top of Arweave, so it's supposed to be built to be maintained for a long period of time without changes. That means that when you build an application, you should be able to depend on the fact it's not going to change, or the APIs and the like that you're using are not going to change under your feet. If you build in a properly decentralized way, it should just remain consistent and permanent forever. This is essentially just like Ethereum contracts, although minus the Ethereum 2 upgrade, which should, I think, break some of these contracts. That's another conversation. Okay, so that's on the technical side of why we think protocols are better than web applications in the general form for offering these services to people. But in the economic side of things, we believe that profit sharing communities represent a significant step up from the traditionally structured startup company. And that's because, for example, ownership in a profit sharing community entitles you to profit. That means that at any point, when you own a profit sharing token from a profit sharing community, which is essentially represents ownership inside it, when people use the application, you will, over time in an amortized way, receive a reward. You received a micro dividend relative to usage of the application, essentially. And this stands in stark contrast to the value that's offered by Web 2 companies, which largely never issue dividends. In fact, most of them have a stated policy simply never to issue dividends. And so you've got to understand as a stakeholder, as a shareholder in one of these companies, the value of these companies is essentially just defined by the essentially betting market on the likelihood that the value of the company in other people's perceived eyes will increase in the future, because there is no fundamental value to it at all. And also it can actually be printed by the governance structure without your say so, really, unless you happen to be one of few very, very large shareholders, but very, very few relative to the vast majority of stakeholders in these organizations. So when you hold shares in this Web 2 company, for example, Facebook's the one I always give because Mark Zuckerberg maintains a 57% majority voting right. So even the sum total of all the other shareholders don't add up to a majority, even if they were all voting against him on governance issues. So you can't really say that the shares have some form of governance value. They don't issue any dividends. They state that very clearly. If you go to investorrelations.facebook.com or whatever it happens to be, you can just Google it. You can see that they're not going to offer value in this way. So it's very hard to put your thumb on where exactly the value in Facebook stock comes from. But it's the same across basically all of the tech space, almost all of the NASDAQ actually. Okay. So in profit-sharing communities, it's the exact opposite. These are assets that have fundamental underlying value that you can rely on. If people continue to use the web application or increase in the usage of the web application, you're going to generate a dividend from it. You're going to essentially generate yield, actually in like APR, almost DeFi style. This is a objectively better, I would argue, form of ownership than you would get in a typical Web 2 company, where you have no access to the actual value that your token, more or less, represents. So next, in profit-sharing communities, you have skin in the game voting, which ensures fairer governance. So in a typical company, or really we're focused on Web 2, but goes for most companies also, voting rights are dependent upon the simple number of shares that people own. But of course, in public markets where you can buy and sell these assets and stakes fairly quickly, then you can plausibly just buy these tokens to take part in governance and then leave again. There happens to be sometimes little requirements that you have to be staked in for a few months or something like this. But there's no concept that the person that is staked in for longest should have the largest say. Whereas in profit-sharing communities, the basic game is, okay, so you want to take part in profit-sharing community governance. You want to take part in the governance of a web application, maybe to talk about what kind of content should be placed on it or not, for example. Then what you want to do is you want to stake your tokens. And that locks them, makes them unavailable for you to sell. And during that period of time, yeah, you can take part in the governance, but also you take the number of tokens you have multiplied by the time you're willing to stake them. And then you compare this to the others as part of the voting process. And you get a voting power based on that relationship. So the person that is most, the person that is most staked into the long-term success of the project ends up being the person that gets the most say in its governance. That leads to better incentives for governance decisions along the way, because people are really incentivized to essentially maximize the value that they're going to gain in these micro dividends over that period of time in which their tokens are locked. The longer the period of time the tokens are locked, the more exposure to the decisions they're going to have. And these profit-sharing communities, obviously, their ownership is represented in tokens, and that means that you can have early liquidity. In fact, actually, because of the way that the decentralized exchange Virto works, you get liquidity on day one. And this ensures market efficiency. So if projects are good, people will just come and buy them. And more money will approximately accrue to the projects offering better services over time, at least. And it also offers people that are involved in these projects the ability to essentially access some of that money earlier. And you've got to compare this to the Web 2 model, where essentially a game is, okay, so we're going to come along, we want to work at a startup, we want to make it into a really big thing. And all these financier components of the market essentially come in and they say, yeah, sure, we'll bet on this. They're betting on it at a very high valuation. But the people working on it have absolutely zero access to the value that they are creating until it potentially IPOs. In a lot of cases, it might not IPO. This just is not an efficient or fair market, really. So early liquidity access, which is clearly seen as well. So the founders, for example, have to show publicly how long they're locking their tokens for, and all of this is visible through one of the interfaces called Community XYZ. Yeah, there's transparency around who has tokens that are unlocked, but also there's fairness around who has access to liquidity and when. This, we think, is just a better and fairer way of structuring things than the traditional Web 2 startup. Ownership can be given as incentives. So typically one of the processes that founders would go through in a Web 2 space or in a Web 2 company is to essentially take some of the equity in the organization, sell some of that to VCs, and get capital in fiat, and then use that capital to more or less buy customers, where this idea of customer acquisition cost comes from. So that capital becomes your marketing budget. So you're essentially giving ownership by proxy of the VCs and the capital system for more users in your system. Well, profit-sharing communities, you can essentially cut out that middleman. You can say, all right, well, if you want to, for example, take part in Gitopia, if you want to mirror your GitHub repo onto Gitopia, which is actually very simple to do, it takes like 2 or 3 minutes, then you can earn some ownership of Gitopia and its future profits and also future governance as a result of doing that. And this, when you compare it to the Web 2 model, is just, I think, kind of objectively better. Like in the Web 2 space, GitHub is saying, okay, start paying us now. We'll let you have private repositories. And then as soon as you stop paying us, we're going to either make them public or turn them off. And that means you have to pay forever. So you're locking yourself in. You're paying to lock yourself in. And yeah, they're just going to extract more and more value from you over time with this relationship. By contrast, if you take part in Gitopia, you pay, yes, like at the beginning when you want to store data. So you pay relative to usage. But over time, you're earning more and more of a stake in Gitopia as a service. That gives you governance rights and access to its future profits, which you can also monetize if you want, because it's liquid, at any point in time. So instead of being locked in, you're becoming the owner of the service itself. I think if we can communicate this correctly and we can execute this pattern correctly, there's no way we can fail against Web 2 startups. I think this is a pretty much unbeatable incentive system. Okay, so all of that is why the PermaWeb is interesting, why profit-sharing communities are something we're really excited about. Now, a quick overview of what's new since the last time we had an Ingram like this, which ended, I think, mid-December. So the first thing is, are we mainstream yet? New York Times wrote an article about essentially Web3 as a space in which Arweave was featured. So this is pretty interesting. Obviously, it's kind of riddled with inaccuracies, but that's okay. It'll take a long time for the mainstream news press to, frankly, the press in crypto sometimes doesn't even get this still. But it'll take a long time for them to catch up, I think. But this is a good step in the right direction. It sees that the world is really paying attention. And I think part of that is because our personal opinions on Donald Trump aside, and Parler, for instance, it's very clear that the issue of web application trust is coming to the fore again. I would say this started in it started to become a mainstream question after the 2016 election, and there was talk of, well, what should Facebook and Twitter have done about people buying adverts on a platform, political adverts, potentially purchased, I think were purchased by foreign actors. What are their obligations in this case? So there was a question of trust around those web services at that point in time. But then it grew, and I think that we saw, in January, like this explosion of that question when a sitting president was removed from essentially the largest social media platform with a public face, if you will. Like Twitter is about public stuff, Facebook's more about private stuff. Donald Trump was essentially removed of his way of speaking to his followers while he was a sitting president, which is really quite profound, I think, regardless of our personal thoughts about the person. And similarly, we saw shortly after this that Parler, which was a platform which conservatives were typically using to speak to one another, was completely removed from the web. Like removed from all of the app stores, which kind of exposes one of the areas of centralization that I think is interesting for us to look at, and people in the PermaWeb community are, but as well as these web service providers themselves, Amazon. And it took them an awfully long time to get back online. This really shows that without, you'd say, due process in court, it's actually very possible to censor people from the internet, large portions, large services with large backing from the internet completely. That's quite a profound shift, I think, relative to where we were before December. It would have been hard to imagine that we would see this in practice on this scale. So these two instances happened. I think that really kicked into the mainstream this question of, hey, what is it that we use web applications for in our lives? How important is that? And what is the relationship of trust we have with those companies that run those services? Also in the PermaWeb ecosystem, there are many new profit-sharing communities that have started up. So welcome to Arweave News, Ecclesia Speech, Kive, Koi, Decentralised, and of course the Arweave Wiki, which is turning itself into a profit-sharing community. All these are super exciting projects, and I'm sorry if I missed your project from the list as well. There's just so many that it is genuinely hard to keep up with where everyone's at any point in time. So welcome everyone. And finally, our funding for profit-sharing communities. So this is funding taken by founders, not by the Arweave organization or anything like that, is sitting at somewhere over 2.5 million now, which is great. I think that's doubled in the last 2 months. So remember, we're just 200 days into this, and 2.5 million in external funding so that founders can quit their jobs and work on this stuff full time, build a decentralized permanent web. It's pretty cool, great to see. And I think there's some pretty big news coming on this front in the next few months as well. So with that, let's talk about the Foundry program a little bit. It's 6 weeks and it's aimed at taking your profit-sharing community to the next level, fundamentally. So for some people, you might be at the founder stage. You're just interested in the space, wondering what you might want to build, or you might have an idea, or you might even have an MVP. You might even have users. You might even have your first funding. We want to take you through this whole process all the way to growth of your application in the real world, adoption of that application. We're essentially here to check in with you and help any way we possibly can along this process. We're going to have a scheduled set of events once every week. We'll be having a session that's kind of like a masterclass, if you will. So we'll bring in experts from around the world who can tell you about their experiences building similar systems, or their thoughts on how they should be built, or how you can use existing tools to do so, as well as tons of sessions with other founders in the ecosystem that are already built stuff, as well as ad hoc sessions for, hey, we're all thinking about this problem, what can we do to solve it together? We're really just here to help support the ecosystem in any way possible. If you have a thought or a question or a comment or anything like that, we want to hear about it. Generally, the way that this works is once we get you onboarded, we'll set up a channel in our Discord server, and yeah, we'll just set up a direct line between you, the founder or founders, and the Arweave team, and we're basically there to be your outsourced team, if you will. So anything that you think that we might be able to help with, please just drop there and we'll give it a go. But Seb is going to cover more of this in just a second. I think one of the key things to note, this is not a normal hackathon. Like, we're not here to build small applications which we're going to abandon after this is over. This is really just a sort of focused period in the middle of an ongoing adoption effort of the whole ecosystem, which I think if you're new to the space, please just reach out to us. We'll put you in touch with the right people, or you can just watch it happen. It's all around you, I think. Yeah, in the Arweave, what do you say, human side of the network, you can see people everywhere pushing adoption of this permanent decentralized web in really incredible ways. So this is not just about starting an interesting project and then abandoning it. We're looking for people to found these projects that are going to become critical pieces of the next web. And that's all over the place. It's already happening. So maybe you're right at the beginning, you're getting looped in, and this you can think of as the springboard to get you to something else. And if you're midway through, this is just like a focused, concentrated period where we can try and get to some shared goals together. Obviously, the Arweave team will do everything we can to help you. We'll be looping in all the other founders to work together on shared questions and problems so that we can move this thing forward. But at the end of this, we should really be looking for a situation where basically you, if you're a founder, you can just quit your job and you can work on this full time if you want to. Like, we want to make it so that anyone that wants to build on the decentralized permanent web can do that. There should be no need for a day job. And actually, given the situation in the capital markets right now, we think that if you work with us very closely to go through that process of finding a great idea, building an MVP, getting your first users on board, then we can get you to that funding stage where you can raise money for it. We are very, very serious about backing you to do that. We've done this for, I guess it must be 15 companies, or not companies, 15 projects right now, at least, where the founders are then able to just work on this one way or another, full-time or essentially full-time if they want to. And we're more than happy to do that for anyone else that has a good idea on top of the system. So after it's all over, we're going to invest 100K in these projects. But that's really nothing relative to the real scale of the money that you'll be able to raise if you build a great PermaWeb application. There's interest from all sorts of high-level investors at this point, even funds spinning up just to back profit-sharing communities on top of the PermaWeb. Yeah, this is just the beginning of the capital, I would say. We're very, very serious. If you can build a great idea on the network and you're a good founder who's able to execute on the necessary things to get this thing adopted, then we are confident that we can help you raise the capital you need to make it your full-time job. That is our job here. And with that in mind, you know, Arweave, the core team, represents like less than 10% of the capital committed to PSCs at this point. And we want to keep it that way, while also we're just getting ready to announce another round of funding, which will show the amount of capital that's available. And we're looking to 10x that by connecting you with the investors that might be interested in your project. And that is something that's worked very effectively so far. And we also have a network of founders now who've already done this and can point you in the right direction. Hey, maybe you should speak to X or Y about your project because it might fit with what they want to invest into. And we're seeing that this is sort of rapidly, actually exponentially increasing for the founders in the ecosystem. It's really exciting to watch. So the final thing I think to say is that if you can't decide what to build, if this sounds interesting to you, but you don't really know where to start, just talk to us. We have a ton of ideas that we can throw your way, and you can see what's interesting and then iterate on and then go build. Or if you have questions around, hey, is it possible to build this? The answer is yes, by the way. Basically, there is no web application that exists on the centralized web that you cannot now build a decentralized version on the PermaWeb. You need to operate at, you could say, the cutting edge of what people are building, but now the infrastructure has really got to the point where this is all completely possible. The world is your oyster, essentially. Or you can just build a PSC version of your favorite app. And this is not just a case of repeating the value that's available in the centralized world. I think because of the reasons we went through for why we believe PermaWeb applications and profit-sharing communities are preferable in general, just previously, you can see that applying these attributes to almost all of the things that currently exist on its own is a huge step up. And it's probably something that you can get adopted if you execute correctly. But on top of that, you can iterate on the model and make it more, what you call, like web stream native. So things like, for example, Decentralised is embedding these decentralized autonomous organizations or communities into the feeds, and then you can buy into these communities and take part in the governance of them, and also earn rewards and so on. Like, you can start embedding those incentive systems into your application as well, for example. Or you can, for example, like Utopia, you can make use of the fact that the network is truly permanent to make a reliable backup and archive of all source code on Git. For example, you can start playing with the core functions that the network offers you, but even if you don't, I think even if you don't and you apply just the basic principles of a PermaWeb application with a profit-sharing community, you can build something that's 10x better than the Web 2 equivalent, and you can get it adopted. All right, thanks so much for listening. Now I'll throw it over to Seb, who will have more details about the program and how you can get involved, how you can get in touch with us, and how things are going to run. I'm really excited about this. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and I'll check out these questions while you speak there. Seb, go for it.
Makes sense. Hey, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much. Apologies, my voice is a little bit coarse, but I hope that you can make it up, make out what I'm going to be presenting to you today here. All right, let's get started. Jesse, can people see my screen? Yep. All right. Okay, let me cover a little bit. Sam went into a lot of detail about the motivations behind it and how the program can actually help you achieve what you actually want to do with your profit sharing community. Now, let me talk a little bit about the program specifics. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we have prepared other dedicated resources that you're free to check at any time that are delivered in a much more efficient way that's, in a presentation. But let me touch upon a couple of key topics here. First of all, this is a program that is designed to help you launch a successful new startup on Arweave's decentralized web in just 6 weeks. This is possible through dedicated, personalized support for the duration of this program and dare I say, also beyond. And this is possible through a mixture of different types of events, a strong curriculum, and different types of communication channels that all put together will hopefully allow you to make the most out of this experience and really, as Sam already mentioned, quit your job and really work on this full time. At the core of all the types of events that we have lie the master classes. So you can think of master classes as sort of the backbone of the entire curriculum. We will have 7 of them, 2 in the first week, so that is this week, and then we will have the rest as we progress. So we start out, the way that we should, which is how are you going to build your profit sharing community? Well, we have a dedicated session for just that. We'll give you an introduction into the main tools for that you will need that are available in the ecosystem today that you will need to build your profit sharing community. We'll also get you in touch with the people who are responsible for those tools and how you can actually integrate them into whatever you're building. The second session is, once you have that, all right, now let's cover the path to market. This is something that Zach Herring, he's active in the Crowdcast chat right now. He will be offering a deep dive into the process of adoption and user acquisition, all the way into creating devotees. So not only people that are recurring users, but actually bring other users into your profit sharing community. Sam will then be touching upon Mechanism Design 101. This is a session that you probably will not want to miss. He will teach you how to model economic incentives in a way or in order to persuade self-interested people to pursue useful behaviors for whatever it is that you are trying to achieve. And so this is a very popular session that we will be having as well. After that, once we have covered those initial topics, now we will be going on to fundraising fundamentals for founders. And what we're going to be learning here is not necessarily your run-of-the-mill fundraising type of strategies, but this is really based on all the experiences that we've had over the past many years dealing with multiple types of investors and the techniques and the insights that we've gathered into how to identify the right type of investor and how to collaborate with them in order to make everyone actually profit and make this a useful endeavor for everyone involved. The fifth masterclass in this series is centered on token economics and distribution. And this will basically help you answer some questions that you'll have at this stage, which will be centered around how much should my total token supply be? How can I implement different types of rewards and distribute these tokens to the appropriate community participants at the right time? All of this will be covered during that session. And now that we're touching upon community, well, that's what the next session is going to be. It's going to be about very granular strategies, going for the very micro, like which type of tools should you be using in order to onboard and maintain a successful community, all the way to which channels you should be employing, and all the way to the best practices that we have learned ourselves, but also other people in the community have been sharing with us in order to not only manage your community successfully, but also to expand that. And then last but not least, we'll be also talking about pitching to pros. This will coincide with a part of the program where we are approaching the pitch day and demo day. And so we'll be focusing on the do's and don'ts when structuring your pitch, building a deck, and having a coherent narrative in order to try to get people very excited about what it is that you're building. This is one type, as I mentioned, this is the backbone, but the flesh, if you will, around this backbone will be a series of other types of events that are much more targeted. So we'll have, for example, pooled programming. This is live coding sessions, both with developers from the ecosystem, as well as core developers from the Arweave team. And they will help you troubleshoot, and they will help you understand better how to build the things that you want to build. We'll also have ad hoc one-on-one sessions, which can be anything from trying to help you get the foot in the door with a potential investor, but also perhaps how to onboard someone that you really want to onboard into your community that's going to bring a lot of added value. That is what ad hoc one-on-one sessions are there for. And as the name implies, we can schedule those at any time that is required. Towards the end of the program, we're also going to start having more individualized pitch practices, where we're going to be working on the specifics of your pitch deck, the narrative that you're trying to build, as well as how to present that in the most effective way. And then all of this program culminates after 6 weeks. It all ends with a big bang, and well, actually two big bangs. One is pitch day, and the second one is demo day. Now, these are big events. We basically invite the entire Arweave community and also external investors to see what your progress has been, to get acquainted with your idea, and to get interested in not only using it, but also potentially investing in it. So pitch day is more focused for nascent ideas that might not be completely fully fledged, but they're still worth listening to. Whereas demo day is really the big one, where you actually are presenting to a really large audience, and when you are really trying to already perhaps going into a fundraising round. These sessions typically last around 5 minutes. You're completely uninterrupted. You have the pulpit to really deliver your message, and afterwards, we engineer a space where you can interact with the people that are attending, be it users or also potential investors. Now, this sounds daunting, and the way to keep this all in check is by having smooth communication channels. And we all know how it is to have multiple inboxes and having to focus on keeping inbox zero across all those different ones. Here, we're going to have three main communication channels. The first one is the Arweave developer Discord. If you haven't joined the developer Discord yet, I urge you to do that first. This is the best. This is the best way to get acquainted not only with the entire cohort, but also with the entire Arweave ecosystem. This is also best suited for whenever you have a technical question that you want to answer quickly. It's not only the Arweave core team helping you out, but it's the whole community supporting you in your journey. The second space that we have here is the Open Web Foundry gather.town. Now, if you're not familiar with gather.town, I urge you to go through the email that you should have received if you already signed up to join the program through Gitcoin, and to click on it. This basically is a much more casual space. It's a virtual space dedicated to you basically just having serendipitous interactions with different founders. So anything from just wanting to exchange ideas to perhaps having a small working session with other team members, your own team members or across teams. This is your space to basically use and interact with others. And by the way, that's also where we're going to be hanging the entire time. And we're divided, the Arweave core team is divided, so split across multiple time zones, so you'll always be able to find someone there. So I urge you to, right after this call, go and check gather.town out, and we'll be seeing you there. Finally, don't forget to, if you're not doing this already, to follow us on Twitter, because Twitter is where we have a big overview of the entire, we have an overview of the entire selection of things that are happening in the ecosystem. This is where you can stay up to date with things that are also external, announcements that are external to the Open Web Foundry, and you will not want to miss out on those announcements. All right, one final message to deliver. And with this, I'll let you go, and I hope to see you on gather.town. One final message is, you should get started now. It doesn't matter if you have a fully fledged startup idea or even a fully fledged startup with a lot of team members, a structured process, a clear vision, or if you're just brand new, you might have some of the skills that you see as necessary to build your startup, but you're missing others. Doesn't matter, just get started now, start building, start interacting with people in the community. You'll be surprised how many of the interactions that I'll build during this program actually end up leading to new ventures, to things that you didn't even envision when you were starting out. So get involved. We're here to support you. Reach us on the developer Discord, reach us on gather.town, and we'll be super excited to see what you're building next. Hope to see you soon. And yeah, thanks again for joining. Have a good one.